Our enemies will suffer and our friends will prosper.
American foreign policy has turned openly white supremacist.
Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, this is the iron fist inside the velvet glove.
Changes in Europe, that is a national security threat to the United States.
The United States has just quietly released one of the most consequential documents of the Trump presidency, the new National Security Strategy. Presidents usually publish one of these in every term, and most of them are forgettable. They're usually weighed down by bureaucratic phrasing and diplomacy. But the document that was just released on Thursday night isn't in that category. It's a worldview inside a transactional manifesto, and it signals the most dramatic reshaping of American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And it's alarmed American allies. The Economist has described it as shorn of the enlightened values that have long anchored foreign policy. America First becomes a naked assertion of power that owes more to the 19th century than the world that America built after the Second World War. And that leads to a document riven by contradictions. So in this deep dive, I want to first explain the big picture, how this document reorders American priorities, before moving into how it treats China and Taiwan, India and Asian security, and how it's literally taken the rug out from under Europe's feet, and the broader shifts in how the US sees the Middle East, migration, and its own hemisphere. And what emerges is a portrait of a superpower narrowing its focus, redefining its interests, and reshaping that very architecture of global power. The opening pages of that strategy make something very clear. The era of American global management is over. It says, the days of the United States propping up the entire world order like Atlas are over. Now, Atlas, in Greek mythology, was that titan condemned to hold up the sky up for eternity. It's an image of endless, crushing responsibility carried on a single pair of shoulders. And the text argues that after 1991, US elites convinced themselves that America should dominate the entire world, and that liberal globalization was both inevitable and beneficial. Now think here of Francis Fukuyama at the end of history thesis. That experiment, the document says, failed. Instead, it frames now a foreign policy around a very small set of core national interests, and describes everything else, which is such things as democracy promotion, multilateralism, global institutions, humanitarian interventions, as being distractions. The NSS rejects that interventionist idea of urging countries to adopt democratic or other social change that differs wildly from their traditions and histories. It says plainly that American foreign policy should only concern itself with the actions of other nations when those actions directly affect or threaten the US interests.
It's not the duty of US troops to solve ancient conflicts in faraway lands many people have never even heard of. We are not the policemen of the world, but let our enemies be on notice.
In other words, the United States is no longer positioning itself as the shepherd of a global order. It's repositioning itself as a very selective power, which is heavily transactional and far more inward-looking. Its America First philosophy is seen throughout the National Security Strategy paper. And this inward turn appears everywhere in that text. The document claims that border security is the primary element of national security, and it elevates immigration to the central national security problem of the 21st century for the United States. It's saying that the era of mass migration must end. It describes migration as a driver of social breakdown and economic stress for the country. And it openly is calling for a reallocation of military and diplomatic resources to stop irregular flows of people into the Western Hemisphere, not just the United States. Now, this is not a rhetorical flourish, it's a hierarchy of priorities. If now border enforcement becomes the top security mission, then everything else is going to become secondary, including some of those theaters that have been central to US strategy for decades. This Trump administration's focus on immigrants we've been watching take place in real time in front of our eyes for this past 1 year, whether it was on illegal immigration, H-1B visas, or the latest, the Somalian influx that the president is talking about. This sweeping and increasingly broad categorization of what is the other, right, affects all non-white people, regardless of when they moved to the United States, whether it was legal, illegal, or even if they were born here. Now, coming to what might be the most important shift in the entire document on foreign policy, it's the articulation of what the White House calls the Trump Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. For 200 years, the Monroe Doctrine said that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to European imperialism. But Trump's strategy now upgrades this old idea for the 21st century. It says that the United States must be dominant here as a precondition for American security and its prosperity. And it signals that a rebalancing of US military forces towards the Americas. The recent strikes on those boats in the Caribbean can be seen as an early indication of this posture. The strategy makes it clear that foreign adversaries must not be allowed to buy strategic assets, ports, mines, or even infrastructure in Latin America or the Caribbean. Now, take this to mean that China needs to stay out of this region. No Chinese investment over ports or any such assets such as that Panama Canal. These are the conditions that were told to the Argentinian president Javier Milei when he was looking for a bailout. No relationship with China. Brazilian President Lula will be an issue for the United States. Remember his statement during the BRICS meeting where he said we don't need emperors. Well, they've already been hit with a 50% tariff rate. And soon, no doubt, we'll also see other political maneuvering by the United States on Brazil. Latin American countries are going to be in trouble. The behemoth is back in town. Now, this is a major break from the Biden and Obama eras, which shifted the power of the United States and its vision and its strategy all towards Asia. Remember the pivot to Asia strategy. Trump's national security strategy, however, places that Western Hemisphere first. Asia is going to be second, Europe third, and everything else from Middle East to Africa much further down the list. Now, do watch the section I'm going to do on Europe, because this is the most chilling message that the Americans could have given to the whole world. Now, before we move to Europe and Asia, though, we need to touch on one more aspect that makes this strategy so uniquely unusual and terrifying. It openly blends foreign policy with domestic cultural politics. Its unapologetic assertion of Judeo-Christian nationalism in a country that supposedly separates the church and the state. But along with that is a discussion of civilizational erasure, points that it seems are taken directly from white supremacist talking points. So it talks about restoring American spiritual and cultural health. It says that strong traditional families are essential to national security. It says America must cherish its past glories, its heroes, and its civilizational identity. The language is unprecedented in a security strategy document. It's also politically and ideologically loaded. It's basically taken that replacement theory and stuck it into the United States national security policy document. And for those of you that may not have heard of this, the replacement theory is a far-right conspiracy theory that claims there's a deliberate effort, whether it's by global elites, whether it's through immigrants, whether it's minorities, and they're all trying to replace the existing population of a country with a new one. The administration is signaling that it sees cultural cohesion as a prerequisite for geopolitical power. Now, coming to China, all of this, how does China fit into this new worldview? Well, the answer is quite complicated, but quite simple at the same time. The strategy did spend some time on China, but the tone is much more restrained than in previous documents. The strategy document doesn't name China as the United States' greatest challenge, as the Biden White House strategy did in 2022. It frequently avoids now naming Beijing directly, and it struck a careful balance between competition and interdependence with China. So for the first time, though, it officially acknowledged that the US and China are now near peers, something that Washington has avoided saying for many, many years. The document even admits that America's old engagement policy has failed because China didn't play the role that the US expected it, i.e., that China didn't do the glasnost with the perestroika, which the Soviets did, which ultimately led to the breakup of the Soviet Union. It says that the United States must rebalance its economic relationship with China. It needs to focus on reciprocity, fairness, and the restoration of American industrial independence. But it also says that trade with China should continue and that the relationship should be mutually advantageous, especially in non-sensitive areas. And it's given China the go-ahead on green technologies. It's not interested in climate technologies. It's clearly said that. China, you can have them, we're not interested. So this reflects that real-world tension inside the administration. You have, on the one hand, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who's been negotiating with Beijing, who pushed for softer language in the document, while the national security camp wanted that harder line. And what we see, therefore, is a resulting hybrid message. There is strategic firmness, but it's coming along with economic pragmatism. And it's the best that China could have expected or hoped from the United States. However, the US is also clearly working with its allies to limit China's economic growth further. And it's pressurizing them, or intends to pressurize them, as we see in this document, to stop importing Chinese goods. The strategy paper says,
we must encourage Europe, Japan, Korea, Australia, Canada, Mexico, and other prominent nations in adopting trade policies that help rebalance China's economy toward household consumption, because Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East cannot alone absorb China's enormous excess capacity.
When it comes to Taiwan, the strategy continues with its traditionally accepted US line. And that's a win for a lot of the US hawks, as far as they see. They were worried that Trump administration may change its tone on Taiwan. So what it's saying is that deterring a conflict over Taiwan is still a priority for the US, and that the United States must preserve military overmatch to achieve that. It's reaffirming the long-standing US policy of not supporting unilateral changes to the status quo. And it's emphasizing Taiwan's centrality to global chip production, as well as the Indo-Pacific security. It's warned that if China captured Taiwan, it would gain access to the second island chain. It would reshape those regional power dynamics, and it would threaten vital trade routes for the United States. And for this reason, the strategy says that the US military will be built to deny Chinese aggression anywhere within the first island chain. But it also adds something new, that Washington will not be doing this alone. Allies now need to increase their spending, basically, and they need to take on far more responsibility for deterrence. Now, the chip production argument to support Taiwan is going to worry that country, at least, because they see the Trump administration, on the other hand, also pressurizing their global giant, their chip giant, TSMC, to set up those large facilities, spending hundreds of billions of dollars that is promised within the United States to manufacture the chips. If the chips go to the US, who's going to help them, is what they think. Now, coming to India, the NSS describes India not in a democratic or value-based terms, which is the traditional we share values together language. It's been kicked out of that. And in comes that transactional language of needing the country as a key Asian partner to counterbalance China economically and strategically. So the document emphasizes the importance of the Quad grouping of the US, Australia, Japan, and India. The document states that the US must deepen commercial relations with India so as to encourage New Delhi to contribute to Indo-Pacific security. For Washington, India is important to the extent that it's the only Asian power with that size, the location, and the trajectory to balance China. So it's meant to be that vassal nation of the US. Do as the US bids. The NSS basically reflects the reality, and it places India firmly inside America's long-term Indo-Pacific calculus. However, outside that, India does not appear as a partner for the US, and this raises uncomfortable questions that have to be answered by Indian policymakers who threw their lot in with the United States. Now, the next 3 years under the Trump administration is going to leave India in an uncertain position, and it's hoping that post-Trump presidency will give it back that position in the US strategy as it had in early administrations. But what if it doesn't? This also means it's not going to be able to take any initiative of joining the other multipolar powers, specifically Russia and China. This leaves it in a limbo, neither here nor there. Not a great position for any country to be. Now, from Asia, the strategy turns sharply towards Europe, and it's here that the language turns brutal. The National Security Strategy paper suggests that Europe is undergoing civilizational decline and faces the prospect of a majority non-European societies within decades, describing immigrants as corrupting the values of the societies they move to. It's a shocking assertion from a country that is itself built on immigration. Donald Trump's own mother was Scottish. His father was the son of a German immigrant. Now the numbers of non-whites in the United States are almost higher than the number of whites. And the US has a much higher percentage of immigration than any European country. Maybe these document writers wanted to live vicariously through the Europeans, and they wrote that, encouraging the revival of these nations as wanted by patriotic European parties should be encouraged. And that's a reference to those populist right-wing parties, including the National Rally in France, the Reform UK Party in Britain, the Alternative for Germany Party in Germany. It's also accusing European governments of censoring political opposition, and has even said that it's going to help to cultivate resistance. What does that mean? So it won't help in spreading democracy, because that's not its job to do. But ironically, it's willing to help to cultivate resistance in order to help those far-right white supremacist parties in Europe. The strategy also accuses Europe of mismanaging the war in Ukraine. It says that European leaders have unrealistic expectations for the conflict and that many of them belong to unstable minority governments. It even claims that a majority of Europeans actually want peace with Russia, but are being ignored by their elites. And it gets even more consequential in terms of Europe. The document questions whether the United States should continue its decades-long security umbrella over Europe. It proposes enabling Europe to stand on its own 2 feet, with sovereign nations taking primary responsibility for their own defense. It points to the new NATO commitment to spend 5% of GDP on defense as evidence that the allies must bear their own share of the burden. And it frames future cooperation not around democratic values, but around cultural and ideological alignment between the two continents. So many of these points seem as if they've been taken straight out of Samuel Huntington's book, Identity, where he mentions immigration to the United States as a huge threat to its success, as the country becomes more Hispanic, according to him, and less WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. No Jews are in there, by the way. No Catholics either. The document pointedly says that NATO cannot be a perpetually expanding alliance. The strategy outlined the Trump administration's modus operandi is an extraordinary departure from 70 years of US strategy in Europe. And as European leaders are reading it as a warning, they should do so as well, that the US is not going to be there for them in the same way it used to. And in light of this, President Macron's trip to China earlier this week, it's seen as an important step for France's strategic autonomy. Now, the Middle East, meanwhile, is dramatically downgraded. It's going to be more of an investment zone than a strategic battleground. The strategy says outright that the region is no longer America's top priority, and that the conditions that once made it central, such as the energy dependence that the US had and those constant conflicts with Israel, no longer hold. The US has not been an energy importer for years now. The importance the Middle East had came from that oil it needed, and then from the hangover from protecting Israel. Now the document claims that violence in the region has declined, and that the US strike on Iran in June significantly downgraded or degraded Tehran's nuclear program, and that the Gaza ceasefire has reduced immediate risks to Israel as well. Now, whether that is accurate or not, the message is clear. The Middle East is not going to dominate US strategic planning the way it did between 2001 to 2020. Instead, Washington sees the region increasingly as a site of investment and technological partnership, especially in artificial intelligence. Remember those thousands of chips that are about to be exported to Saudi Arabia and to the UAE for billions of dollars in return. Now, the strategy will still affirm support for Israel and the need for protecting those shipping lines that the US wants, but the emotional and strategic weight the region once had is being pulled back overall. Now, all of this sits on top of a broader doctrine of American economic nationalism. The strategy is going to call for rebuilding American industrial capacity. It's securing its American supply chains and ensuring that the United States is never dependent on outside powers for critical materials. It says it wants to grow the US economy from 30 trillion to 40 trillion by the 2030s, which requires restoring manufacturing capacity and controlling strategic sectors in the country. In this worldview, economic strength is that national security. Tariffs are the tools for their statecraft, and industrial policy is going to be as important as military power. So what does all of this add up to? Well, for the first time in decades, a US national security strategy is not being organized around global leadership, is not being built on alliances, and not going to be structured around universal values. Instead, it's now going to be much more narrow, it's going to be transactional, and is deeply tied to domestic politics. It's seeing the world through the lens of immigration control, the hemispheric dominance, cultural cohesion, and intends to target economic competition. China, on that line, remains a priority. But it's no longer the organizing principle. Europe is basically being declared as being redundant. The Middle East, downgraded. And Latin America is going to become the new front line of American foreign policy strategy. So the US foreign policy has entered this new era. And the shockwaves, of course, will be felt far beyond Washington. I'm Najma Minhas with GVS Deep Dive. Share with me your thoughts on this change. Thanks for joining me today and have a great day.